Being a good GM requires consistency, endless preparation, and player appreciation. This is Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. Hello, welcome to Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I am Robert the Narrator, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Confessions. I have just finished my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time series with last episode, and I was looking over my list of games and I realized something. I just want to do a little bit of a recap this episode and also do a couple of honorable mention games that didn't make my top 10 list. But first I want to talk about the really unusual thing that I realized about my list. And it probably isn't unusual because I am the narrator. This should not be surprising to anyone that I walk the middle path when it comes to role playing. When I put my list of top 10 favorite RPGs together, I didn't have any criteria other than games that I really loved that had a great effect on me. I wasn't trying to fulfill any particular category or any genre or anything like that. And one day I was just looking over my list and I noticed something. My top 10 list is evenly divided pretty much between three genres and the three levels of rules complexity. I have 4 science fiction inspired role-playing games on my top 10 list: Eclipse Phase, Star Wars Edge of the Empire, Shadowrun, and Numenera. I have 3 fantasy RPGs: 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, Exalted, and Earth Dawn. And I have 3 Supers RPGs on my list: Marvel Saga, Mutants and Masterminds 3rd edition, and Champions. So my list is pretty much perfectly divided between 3 main genres in the hobby, and very closely evenly divided between the different levels of complexity. I have to say, with the science fiction games, Eclipse Phase is a rules-heavy game. I think Star Wars Edge of the Empire, there's an argument that you can make that it's rules medium. And Numenera, there's an argument that can be made that it's rules light. When it comes to the fantasy RPGs, I think that there isn't a rules light game in the bunch. I think Earth Dawn and Exalted may be rules heavy, and 5th edition may be rules medium. And with the Supers games, Marvel Saga is rules light, Mutants and Masterminds is rules medium, and Champions is rules heavy. So this is a huge coincidence because, as I said, all I did was formulate the list from what I remember really enjoying and really affecting me during my time in the hobby. I wasn't trying to make sure that was representation and that. So it just so happens that my whole role-playing philosophy of I love role-playing and I love games also extend to my favorite RPGs of all time, where there is great representation of multiple genres and a representation of the different levels of rules complexity. I mean, some may say that the different levels of rules complexity may occur anyway because a large majority of the games in the earlier days of the hobby tended to be rules heavy, and as I went on through my time in the hobby, I tended to prefer a more rules medium or a lighter rule set. So that could explain that. But I really do love multiple genres, multiple settings, and that really is reflected in my list. And I was blown away when I realized that. I didn't realize that until I was just randomly sitting around one day and looking at the list. That is really funny. So tell me, do you have a love for multiple genres, multiple settings, multiple different rules experiences, or do you prefer or like to stick with one particular type of setting or genre or level of rules complexity? Because that has been my experience. I think there are individuals out there. There are more individuals, and I've never done a survey, but my experience has been that there are individuals who prefer to stick with one genre and one type of rules heftiness to the exclusion of everything else. That's been my experience. So being a narrator is a unique gift. So I just found that funny and unusual. So the honorable mentions for my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time. This is in no particular order. I'm going to go through a few games here that I still own on my shelf. I mentioned a while ago that I have, well, this part I haven't mentioned, but over the years I have sold or gotten rid of tons of games when I have moved and I didn't want to lug tons of books there. They are so heavy. I have given away or sold many, many things from my collection. So my collection is really, really small. And this is what I have said in previous episodes. I know that I want to at least own a hard copy of my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time. I've already said that I wanted to do that, but these are a couple of games that I own, and I've been thinking about picking up a couple of hard copies of recently released games that really pique my interest, but there's almost no chance at all that I'm ever going to run them. And I've also said previously that I'm not the type of role player who likes to collect games that there's no chance that I'm going to play. But I think there are some out there that I do want to pick up a hard copy of and add to my collection. But I really, really do want to have every one of my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time on my bookshelf at minimum. But these I still have. These also rans I still have. And I think I'm going to start with the biggest one here. This is 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. If you've heard me say it once, you've heard me say it 1,000 times. I love, love, love a box set, and I love alternate task resolution mechanics like cards. I love games that don't use dice. This game does use dice, but this game uses very special dice. This was the first iteration of the Star Wars narrative dice. This was released first in 2005 by Fantasy Flight Games. And I have to be honest, I have still to this day never sat down and actually played any edition of Warhammer Fantasy Role Playing, any of the games that preceded this edition. Still haven't played it. The thing that solely convinced me to check this game out is the unique narrative die mechanic and the packaging that they did with this. Now, when Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition came out, This box set was $99.99. It was, in my memory, it was the most expensive role-playing game core set that had ever been released. And again, I haven't done any research on that. I just can't remember a core set being so expensive, and it was a big deal in the hobby back in the day. For Dungeons and Dragons, for example, you would pay $100 for the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. When back in the day, when they were $29.99, so I didn't know what the big deal was about a RPG core rule book being $100, because if you're a game master, you're used to paying that anyway. But there was a little bit of an uproar, and this was a complete departure from not only Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but for anything out there. And when I saw this, man, I just had to, it was a box set. It was using those awesome narrative dice, and I just had to take a look at it. This thing is a monster. It has this nice slip case on it, and this is really fantastic. This was designed by Kevin Little, the same designer of the Fantasy Flight Star Wars RPG line. And when I found out that Fantasy Flight Games had gotten the Star Wars RPG license, the first thing I said is, please, please, please use the narrative dice system from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and they did. So what you get in this enormous box is you get a Tome of Blessings, this book, and this is, what is this? It's been a while since I've looked at this. These are the rules for playing magic users. Priests, talks about corruption and heresy, talks about the different faiths, imperial cults. So that's what this talks about. Really nice little book. And then you have Tome of Mysteries, a guide to wizards and magic. So this is the same thing, but for wizards and magic, not just priests. And it tells you about how to use magic. Okay. And you also have in this $99 box set little token standees. They can pop out. Yes, they gave you tokens that you could use during the game, characters. And then you also have these other tokens, progression tracker, damage, and so forth. You can keep track of. I think this was well worth the money that you paid for it. Then you have the Tome of Adventure, a guide to game mastery and role playing. So this is basically, this right here is your Dungeon Master's Guide. It has your creatures in it, your NPCs, the stats for all of them, and how to run the game, so forth. And then you have the Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing Game Rulebook. So these are all of the rules for how to play the game, including character creation. And then you have a ton of cards. All of the abilities that players have are represented with these little cards. So when they chose a an ability, they would get this card which describes the ability, and it sits in front of them on the table. Some of them have to be marked when the ability is used because some of them have a limited use. So you have all of these cards. You have these tiny little cards here. Spells and lingering effects. And then what else? Yeah. And then this is a little player box where the player could put all of their stuff in this box and keep it in here for safekeeping. And then they had these little cards which are your career cards. So you randomly got a couple of careers when you started playing the game, and this represents your careers, your how you advance your character, and also any ongoing abilities that you're using can be placed here on the edges so you can keep track of how many ongoing abilities your character has. This is really awesome, man. I've always loved this. I've ran it a couple of times. And one aspect of the and then you of course you have the narrative dice that you got that you're familiar with. They're just a little bit different from Star Wars. The little plastic stands you can stand your character tokens on are in here. I think the one mechanic that I just have to mention that I loved about this game is, of course, not only did player characters have character sheet, but there was also a party character sheet in this game. Yes, the party itself, the total party, had a sheet, and essentially, what your group would do would be to pick what type of party it was. And you know, this one is like gang of thugs. This one is servants of justice. What else do we have? One. I'll show you one more. Well, you kind of get the idea. Basically, the party selects what type of party it's going to be, and the party shares an ability that they can use. And they have this little track at the top of the party sheet. And whenever there was conflict or disagreement in the group, this track would go up or go down depending on if the party is in conflict or agreeing. And then at certain points, you wouldn't have access to the shared ability that any member of the party could use based on what type of party it was. And that's the first time that I had ever seen a role-playing game use a party-wide mechanic, and the fact that it kind of encouraged the party to not be in dispute, because if they were having issues and were in some type of dispute or there was some type of unrest within the party, they couldn't use the party's special abilities that they get depending on what type of party they were. And that's really awesome, man. I love this. I don't think, even though I'm never going to probably run this game again, it is, I just love it so much that I would never get rid of it. It's so different. It's so unique. I would never get rid of it. And I have sold my Star Wars Edge of the Empire rule books and adventures and dice that I had, but I'm still holding on to this. Of course, they didn't release Star Wars in this large box set format, but this is so unique and so awesome that I had to mention that. The next game that I want to mention, I had a friend who actually wrote for White Wolf Game Studios. And I've always been a fan of this video game. And when I found out that White Wolf was doing a role-playing game, I was so happy. And then I just happened to have a friend who wrote for the game. He couldn't tell me about it until one day he was able to talk about it and invited me to, I think it was Virginia, maybe? My friend Sean, to do a play test with representatives of White Wolf. And that game was Street Fighter, the role-playing game. I've always loved Street Fighter 2, the video game. I used to actually go out and play it in arcades. And when I found out that White Wolf was doing a role-playing game, I was all over it. And this game is so fun and so unique. It uses White Wolf system of dots, where you have 5 dots for your attributes and your abilities. You add them together and roll a pool of d10s. But also what it does, again, I love role-playing games that use cards. Now, I didn't get this game because of the cards. It was just a bonus. However, this uses combat cards, which of course they didn't. It's not a box set, so they didn't have physical cards. You basically had to print them out yourself. And what you would do is you would get your maneuvers. You would fill out the speed, the damage, and how far your character can move. And during combat, each player chose their maneuver secretly, and then at the same time revealed them. And then the speed would tell you when everyone moved, depending on what maneuver they secretly chose, how much damage they're going to do, and of course how far they can move in the scene. And it was like playing the video game, because of course when you're playing a video game, you don't know what maneuver your opponent is going to use. And that was kind of simulated with the combat card that you played out of your hand, man. And I really love this. My friend Sean worked on this game and signed a copy for me. Really awesome. Street Fighter. And the last game that I want to do a honorable mention for is a game that is related to one of the games on my top 10 list. Just like, I guess, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was kind of related to Star Wars. The Cypher System rulebook. Numenera by Monty Cook Games is on my list of top 10 favorite RPGs of all time. It was game number 6 on my list, and I've actually met Monty Cook. He's a really awesome guy. Played in one of his games. It was fantastic. And the Cypher System is the system that powers Numenera, and they released this as a generic system. You can do any genre using the Cypher System rules. And this book is the reason why I am not interested in purchasing any other generic system. I was looking at Genesis for a while because, of course, Genesis uses the narrative dice that I love so much from Star Wars. But then I thought to myself, well, hey, I don't want to add another game to my collection that I'm not going to get an opportunity to play, especially given the fact that I own a generic RPG system that I would love to run for someone. So this is probably going to be the last generic role-playing game that I ever own. I love Cypher System. It is so easy to run. Monty Cook has made a game that makes the game master's life so easy. It is so user-friendly. You can make up an NPC literally in 2 minutes by deciding pretty much one number. And I love, love, love this game. What I've always wanted to do is I've always wanted to do a campaign, a supers campaign, where I had all of the players playing 2 characters. And essentially what I wanted to do is have the public pick the characters that were going to make up the super team, kind of like a reality show, a survivor elimination kind of thing. And I may do that at some point, and if I do, I wanted to use Cipher System. So this is a really great game. Really love Numenera. Really love the Cipher System. It's an awesome game. So those are my honorable mentions for my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time. Thanks a lot for joining me again. And I'll see you next time. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever and whenever you are. Bye-bye.